Well, on behalf of the Historical Society of Woodstock, I would like to welcome everybody to our latest Zoom presentation. I'm Janine Fallon-Maurer, part of the Historical Society Board, and I believe that if it's recorded, it's eventually going to show up on our YouTube channel, so you'll have opportunity to see it in the not too distant future again, if you like. So the title for tonight's show is Roots of Activism. Elisabeth Freeman, suffragette, civil rights worker, pacifist, and ancestor of the late Woodstock councilperson Jane Van de Bogart. This is the latest of our ongoing series that Olivia Twine is managing, Standing on Their Shoulders, 100 Years of Voting and Still Marching for Women's Rights. And this is a celebration of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution. For those of you that are not familiar with us, the Historical Society is a member-supported and volunteer-managed historical society in Woodstock, New York. We're beginning our 92nd season this year, and we believe presentations like this are helpful to fulfill our goal of outreach to the greater community of people interested in the history of Woodstock and the people who have lived here. So I think am I turning this over to Peg, I believe? Or Olivia?
Probably to me for the moment.
You got it. Okay.
Hi, I'm Olivia. Okay, this program is sponsored with a grant from Humanities New York with assistance from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Historical Society of Woodstock. The views expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the opinions or policies of Humanities New York, the National Endowment for the Humanities, or the Historical Society. Tonight we have Peg Johnston of Binghamton, New York, who created an interactive scrapbook on Elisabeth Freeman, her great aunt, drawing on source material from family archives. She is the author with Thomas Dublin, PhD, of the articles, How Did Elisabeth Freeman's Publicity Skills Promote Women's Suffrage, Anti-Lynching, and the Peace Movement, and she curates historically themed installations. She has a wonderful presentation to give us. First, I'd like to ask Marguerite Kearns, a former editor of the Woodstock Times newspaper who collaborated with Jane Van de Bogart, to give a few words, to speak briefly about Jane Van de Bogart. And she is the author of An Unfinished Revolution, Edna Buckman Kearns and the Struggle for Women's Rights, published by SUNY Press, to be released June 1st, 2021. So now I'll turn it over to Marguerite.
Well, the story of Marguerite Kearns, the story of Jane Van de Bogart and me meeting up with her in the 1970s was one way of launching this long struggle to fill in a piece of Woodstock, New York's history. And I was covering the Woodstock Town Board at that time, and I happened to say just casually to Jane, "Hey, why do you do this work?" And she said, "It's because of my great aunt, Elisabeth Freeman." And of course, that's when it started. We got my grandmother's suffrage campaign wagon up from Pennsylvania. It's now in the New York State Museum. And Jane's family and Peg's family, of course, were definitely right there with us and participated in the research and the presentation. And it's also, that story is also in my book, this picture of Jane Van de Bogart and Alf Evers in particular in the book. And it was the story of how we discovered that Elisabeth, Peg's great aunt, and Edna, my grandmother, not only knew each other, but they worked together in the suffrage movement, and they drove wagons as one tactic to get out into the rural areas and talk to people. And of course, both of them were very interested in reaching diverse audiences, and that's what we're going to hear a little bit about tonight from Peg. And so, Peg, it's been a long journey, but here we are, finally, yes. And I'd like to turn it over to Peg Johnston from Binghamton.
Thank you, Marguerite, and congratulations on your book. That is quite a life achievement. I'm in awe. Thank you. As long as we're still talking about my cousin Jane, let me show you a couple of pictures of her because some of you knew her. So this is, well, I should probably start in chronological order, but it's a lovely picture of her when she was young and extremely idealistic. Not that she was ever not idealistic. And she, as you know, was involved in virtually every progressive cause you could imagine. And this is sort of her, oops, hold on a second. This is her sort of official picture. And then I happen to have here a portrait that my great aunt, this would be Elizabeth's sister Jane, who was a portrait artist. And where am I here? So this is Jane as a young girl as a portrait by Jane Freeman. So it's a lot of family stuff. And Jane Freeman did this Albert Schweitzer behind me. So try not to make you too dizzy. So what I've done is created a, where am I here? I've created a video that I'm going to show, and it just is, then I'll be able to show it elsewhere. So let me just make sure I can open this full screen. So when I graduated from college, my mother said, look at this Elisabeth Freeman scrapbook. Elisabeth Freeman was my mother's aunt, my great aunt, and my mother was her favorite niece, and that's how we got the scrapbook. And the scrapbook was created by her mother, about Elizabeth's mother, Mary Freeman. And she would go on these long speaking engagements and across country and so forth and send back clippings. And her mother kept up this scrapbook that is just chock full of information about all the causes that she was involved in. And it inspired me to do more research, and I did several jaunts to archives, and then eventually to do an exhibit at the Cooperative Gallery and to do a website where I tried to put a lot of different information about Elisabeth Freeman, and much of it is from the scrapbook. And it also inspired my cousin Jane Van de Bogart with Marguerite Kearns to do an exhibit also in Kingston, New York. So Elisabeth was born in Britain and came here as a child, but then returned a couple of times with her mother. And on one of those visits, she got involved with the Pankhursts, who were militant English suffragettes. And they were militant in the sense that they risked arrest and physical harm to present their grievances to Parliament. So they would go on these deputations and they would try to get their petitions to Parliament, and then inevitably they'd be arrested. So this slide is Miss Phillips getting out of jail, where she was forcibly fed, and and Pankhurst is on her right. And basically, they made a pageant or a demonstration every time they could do that. So they encouraged women to join them on a deputation, which was no small feat, because you pretty much were going to get roughed up by the police and arrested and then put in jail and so forth. They also did a lot of pageantry as media. So remember, there was not, radio or television. They had newspapers, and then they had in-person crowds. So this was a coronation march. So somebody was getting coronated, the Queen, I assume. And so they did a suffrage version of that and drew huge, huge crowds. And this was an international delegation. This is Elisabeth on the right. She was the organizer of the international delegations, and this is the French delegation. So pageantry was really a very big thing. So she was in England from 1905 to 1911, and then she came back to America, and she was a speaker and an organizer for suffrage and hired by suffrage organizations. And she was known as militant, and she really traded on that reputation quite a bit. So she knew that would get press headlines. So in this article, Prepare to Do Battle, and she talks about how they used to go to the seashore, and if they were going to throw rocks or break windows, they would practice it with stones at the beach, which, was great copy. And that was her goal, is to get constantly in the media and to have supper time, this be the conversation. So she teamed up, this is her in her wagon and on the left is Rosalie Jones, who was an heiress and a fierce suffrage person. And so they, on several occasions, would get a wagon and go around the country and talk about suffrage. And they would go all over various places to spread the word, and they were hired to do that mostly. And this is a famous picture of her on a soapbox on a corner where she could just talk anywhere. She did platform speaking, regular lectures, but she also just would gather a crowd on a street corner and speak. So their most famous was the Pilgrim hike to Washington, D.C. in February of 1913. And basically they upstaged Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And you can see from this slide that they got a lot of great coverage. They had embedded reporters, and every single day they would be in the New York papers, and then as they walked from New York to Washington, D.C. in February, they got into the newspaper. And she's third from the right in this picture. But you can see the whole trajectory of their trip. Now, this was a separate walk to Boston, and they were trying to promote the Women's Journal, which is the oldest feminist and suffrage paper in the country. And so that you can see from the wagon that they had, that they decorated it. And so everything was about media. Everything was about spreading the word, getting attention. They even had a hurdy-gurdy. So Elisabeth was really fearless. She was willing to do pretty much any stunt to get publicity for suffrage. So she would speak, anywhere that she was allowed, including like prize fights and car shows. And here she's posing with this bear, this small bear. And so she just really went anywhere and everywhere. This was an interesting point where she collaborated, or all these women collaborated with Thomas Edison to do one of the very first talkies. And the sound did not survive, but the film did. And she was one of the most natural and animated speakers, as you may see. When I look at this, it's very clear that Elisabeth didn't really know what this was all about. Of course, nobody did. This was one of the first talkies. But she's, kind of talking and looking at people and twisting around and very animated, as opposed to everyone else who's trying to be very serious. And I think it really captures who she is. So you'll notice that at least one of the speakers had a very formal way of, chopping her arm. And when Elisabeth comes, she's just very natural and very to the point. You can tell that she's nervous. And in the articles, which of course this was covered very thoroughly in the papers, that she said, there's no audience. I don't know how to speak to empty air. There's no audience. And so that was sort of difficult for her. I think she was a really great extemporaneous speaker and could bounce off the people in the audience. And of course, this film was shown in movie theaters as sort of like a, newsreel in the beginning of a feature film.
And of course it got booed and hissed and so forth in the movie. So I'm not sure it helped Thomas Edison any, but it was a great experiment, and she was right there. Whenever she could, she would take time from her suffrage work to support the Women's Trade Union League, which was the garment workers, and particularly when they went out on strike for higher wages and safer conditions, then she would join their picket lines and in some cases get arrested. And these were primarily Italian and Jewish immigrant workers. And so she would get in the newspaper because she was someone that got in the newspaper. And she would say, you know, these police and the hired henchmen were really awful, and the poor strikers are locked up in cells without a voice. And so she used her notoriety to champion the trade union workers. And then she would get arrested too. And of course they were released pretty quickly, but you know, every time you get arrested, you get in the newspaper and you get their cause out there. So that was sort of her strategy all along, is to draw as much attention to the cause as possible. The Triangle Fire was in a factory, and what was common is that the owners of the factory would lock the doors to keep people from sneaking out or stealing this stuff. And so a fire broke out, and all these people were trapped in the fire. And some of them jumped, and some of them, you know, just tried to get out. Many perished. And it was a very big cause at that time. There were protest meetings, and some good came of that. But Elisabeth was definitely one of the speakers at this particular meeting, and in general, protesting the treatment of garment workers. She also teamed up with Upton Sinclair, whom she clearly knew, because Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Company that he owned opened fire on miners in Colorado and their families and killed many of them. And it was really quite an outrage among labor organizers and labor supporters. So she got arrested with him on a couple of occasions, and they would do a silent vigil in front of Standard Oil to draw attention. In 1916, she was hired as an organizer in Texas. So she went down by train in Texas, and this little clip was a letter to her mother where she said, "Oh, guess who I ran into? Roy Nash, who's going down to Georgia to investigate where all those lynchings happened. Lynching of black people happened. And we had a nice chat, and he left the train this morning." So this chance encounter led to Roy Nash contacting her in Texas when there was a lynching in Waco. And she was very close to Waco at that time. And he said, "Won't you go get the facts for us?" The NAACP was a relatively new organization and mostly white, and they knew that the lynching issue was one that would get traction among black people, but also among whites, and really get the organization going. And so she did a full report, which they did almost word for word in a publication. And then she went on speaking tours all across the country, actually 2 different speaking tours, to raise money to publicize this lynching and to organize against it. So everywhere she went, there would be this picture of her, very sweet picture of her, and this horrific picture of this lynching. And she went, again, all over the country. So this is just one thing from her. July 16th, she did this, and you could just see that she just did a lot of organizing and reporting back to NAACP. So she basically gathered intel about the Black communities all over the country and their ability to organize. This was one of the publications that they produced based on her information. So as soon as she got done with the anti-lynching campaign, she was contacted by Frances Keller, who later went on to be the first woman in FDR's cabinet. And she recruited Elisabeth to be part of the Hughes campaign train that went from New York to San Francisco and to LA and back in a big loop, campaigning for Charles Evans Hughes, who was opposing Woodrow Wilson. And he actually was favored in the race. He ultimately lost, as we know. But she was recruited to talk to Black audiences, especially, in favor of Charles Evans Hughes and his more liberal, less Southern approaches, but also on suffrage and trade union. And she couldn't help herself. She would just speak on whatever issues she wanted to. But this is the very first time that women were used explicitly in a partisan election. So before that, it was like just about the vote. It wasn't about, oh, we favor this candidate over this or this party over this. So this was really kind of an important thing. And they were very famous people, intellectuals, rich people, wives of government officials, that sort of thing. So this is an article about her speaking. And again, she would get in the newspaper every single stop. And she would speak about anti-lynching, suffrage, labor. It says, in opening, she spoke a word for national suffrage, but was soon discussing Negro problems. And then she would sort of say stuff about Wilson and stuff about Hughes and the difference. And she said, in the South, the Negro is really disenfranchised, but I notice that in the North, the Democrats make a mighty high bid for the Negro vote. And Charles Evans Hughes was a Republican. This is a picture of her in Danville, Illinois. So when she had a stop there, she would get a picture imposed with the Black community. So in 1917, I think she probably was not able to get hired as a suffrage speaker any longer because of her anti-lynching work. I don't know that for sure, but she got involved and was hired by the Emergency Peace Federation and then ultimately the People's Council for Democracy and Peace. And she was a lobbyist for them and a secretary, and she was charged with organizing a conference so that they could set up their organization. And they kept going from kind of pillar to post trying to get a meeting site, and kept getting frustrated by local officials saying, no, we don't want those cowards, those pacifists, those peaceniks, those sad-eyed doves is another way they called them. So again, the newspapers made a big deal about how she was this pacifist, but she fights like a demon. And that whole militant suffrage stuff that was her reputation. So this is where they actually sent troops to break up their little meeting, and it was a pretty little meeting. And they, in the press, they called them the sad-eyed doves. And in this case, whereas before the publicity, the media coverage was largely positive, and they was like plucky little English woman, that sort of descriptor. And in this case, they were really seen as, traitors. There was a lot of war fury going on, and they were the sad-eyed doves, and, it was largely negative press. So after the war, the record goes a little bit cold in terms of newspaper publicity, in terms of the scrapbook. But she stayed active in different causes, and sometimes sort of left-leaning causes. And she eventually started an antique store in Provincetown for the summers. And then she moved to Pasadena, California. I think one of her benefactors gave her an apartment to live in. And in 1941, she died of pleurisy there. And this is the obit in the local Women's Party publication. This is a great description of who she was. Soapbox speaker, banner bearer, colorful organizer. Always the hardest work fell to her lot and was conquered by her enthusiasm. And I think that's actually quite true. I mean, she really had an incredible passion and enthusiasm and energy that she brought to various causes that she was involved in. And she was just fearless. I mean, there are other accounts, not in the scrapbook, but where she would jump up on a table and the police were at the front door and she would slip out the back, but she would give her speech first. And she just was irrepressible. She signed all of her letters faithfully or faithfully yours, and then her initials EF.
And that's the end of that little video that I did, which I'll put up on YouTube somewhere. But you have also captured it too. Hopefully there wasn't too many little crazy interruptions from Zoom. But if you have questions or comments, I'm happy to try to respond if you like.
Peg, how has the life of Elisabeth Freeman influenced you personally in your life?
Well, it's hard to separate out all the relatives, honestly, because as Jane did, I come from a family of a lot of activists and so forth. But I was really, I think, right out of college, really captured by the history of it. I mean, she was like Forrest Gump. I mean, she was like there for every little, movement. And so it really got me excited about history. And I'm not sure I would have done that otherwise. So that's a key piece. But my own activism actually took me away from this. I mean, I could have stayed a historian or tried to be a historian or something. And yet I thought I would make my own history. And I've been involved with sexual violence against women. And that was an early job, and community organizing, and more lately in most of my career, abortion provision and abortion care and abortion rights. So and abortion culture change, I think, is probably the bigger, broader issue for me. But I've got a lot of irons in the fire, and so did she. And so maybe that's sort of a kind of a theme among us. Go ahead.
I love the presentation that you just pulled together. I would also like to say that in the Library of Congress, they have a very extensive suffrage collection, the Bain collection, and Elisabeth is represented in about 20 pictures. I've identified her. So she was everywhere, and including in the official record. And very little is known about her, I think, compared to. And why do you think that is? True.
Well, I think, there are a lot of, I think women in general are kind of left out of the picture for longest time. But then, as with any popular historical kind of movement or history, you know, they cherry picked, you know, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and, you know, maybe Harriet Blatch or, you know, but not even her, you know, so they picked the leaders. She was not, she was a worker bee. I mean, quite a worker bee, but still a worker bee. And so I think that, you know, she was what I call a footnote to history. So I think that's not so unusual. And, you know, and I've tried in pretty relatively small ways to put her story out there. But, you know, I mean, we're talking about, you know, a little website that, you know, might get 1,000 looks or something, and versus, you know, a book or New York Times bestseller, or, you know, the media is, unlike her times, the media is sort of stacked against us. So yeah, I think so. I should mention that there is a book where she is the heroine, and it's called The First Waco Horror by now I'm forgetting her first name, Patricia Bernstein. And it's really a lovely story. And she didn't know anything about my work on Elisabeth Freeman when she wrote it. And she was like, who is this family? Why isn't there an obit, you know? And she was like, sort of, when she first talked to me, she was like, why didn't your family do an obit? I mean, it's before I was born, you know, but anyway, it was pretty funny. But the other, since you mentioned the archives, the other really kind of touching thing for me is if you go to the new museum on the African American Museum, and you know, the museum starts with the depths, you know, the really dark, and it moves up more toward the light. So you turn a corner and there's a portrait of her, sort of like, and one of the very, very few white people in that whole display. And that, to me, that's very touching. You know, I think she did risk a lot going to Waco, and she probably loved it. You know, she told my mother at one point that somebody said to her, you know, if you don't want to hang on that tree, you better get the hell out of town. And so I'm sure she did risk quite a lot to get there, but you could clearly loved it if you read Patricia's book, or if you read any of the documents from that time. She, you know, she really, you know, change characters. She would change her dress and change her hair and put on an English accent. And then the same people would think she was a different person. And she kind of finagled getting all the photographs that subsequently the NAACP published. And she, you know, talked to the jurors, she talked to the judge, she talked to the sheriff. She, you know, I mean, she just went, and she went to every church, every Black church, and apologized. She went to every white church and said, you know, how can you let this happen, kind of thing. So it's pretty fascinating little piece of history. So
there are a couple of questions. Weston wants to know who sponsored her travels.
Well, in that particular campaign, the NAACP gave her, you know, it wasn't a small amount for that time, but like $25 a week. And you'd see there's in their archives, which are also at the Library of Congress, which are quite wonderfully kept, and all those great letters between all the people in the organization. And they would say, well, we're advancing you, you know, $50 for expenses. And she would send, well, I raised, you know, $5 in this meeting and $10 in this meeting. And it was really very nickel and dime. And their goal was 10,000, and I think they made it. But I don't know if they made it from her kind of small gatherings. But I think the real thing she did was really to give the national office some understanding of who was out there and what their issues were and what they needed to work on and so forth.
Thank you. Stephanie is asking, was she in touch with Ida B. Wells during the anti-lynching work?
I know they crossed paths. I don't, you know, the interesting thing, and why I probably didn't pursue this much further, is that we had this great scrapbook, but then it's not backed up. There's a picture of Ida B. Wells in the scrapbook, but I don't have any like letters or anything like that. So they may exist, and I just stop when I ran out of time. But they certainly had to have known of each other for sure. I mean, it was too small a group. So
Thank you. How about her work with Edna Kearns? And Marguerite's here, so we know that Elizabeth and Edna Kearns both drove suffrage wagons.
yes, they did have a couple of overlaps. I think the most direct one was a march to Albany. And by this time, I think the march thing was getting a little old for Elizabeth. I found one little notice that said, Miss Freeman had to do an emergency wedding or something like that. And so she left and then went back onto the thing and subsequently made it to Albany, but rejoined them later. And I think they also both did, and I don't know at the same time, but both did a lot of canvassing on Long Island. And I think Rosalie Jones was, of course, a Long Island heiress whose mother and sister were very anti-suffrage. So it's kind of an interesting family dynamic. Margaret, you probably have more to say about that.
Yes, it was. I love the story of Elisabeth Freeman, not only because she worked with my grandmother, but because it shows, it has a lesson. There's a takeaway for us today that there's an incredible resource in terms of descendants and those who are spiritual descendants of many of these very active organizers, and that it was very exciting in terms of the unity that they saw the necessity for, and actually worked on that basis to enhance what little power they thought they had, but they really had a lot of personal power. And I think that that's what I really got from the presentation you made, Peg, is the excitement and the drama and the collaboration and the importance of seeing common ground and working from that common ground. It's a wonderful story, and Woodstock, New York is part of that story, even though Elizabeth herself didn't go to Woodstock in terms of a retreat, but other suffrage activists did, and and also Woodstock, New York may be the only town in the United States, I don't know of any other, where there's a photograph of the first women voters in 1917, and that photograph is a classic. I love that image of the first Woodstock voters, and so there was a lot going on in Woodstock in terms of, I think it was 1872. I'm not sure the year, but Overlook Mountain House drew a lot of different people from all over the United States, and there was a straw vote over Horace Greeley and what's his name? Why I can't remember it. This is a senior moment. Grant, yeah, Ulysses S. Grant, and as there was a straw vote in Woodstock and who was going to win, and because women were cut out of this episode, this experiment, there was a big hoo-ha about it. So, but that just opened it up. By the turn of the century and also 1910 on, there was a great deal of activism in Woodstock of people on a national level and a state level coming to Woodstock, also Long Island, to rest and recuperate and produce creative work. So there's many different levels in which we can look at Elisabeth Freeman and Edna Kearns. And because Jane Van de Bogart was somebody who was very prominent during the 1970s because of her work on the Woodstock Town Board, that's how we just got ourselves into this whole story and the need to tell it. And when I first worked with Jane, which was in the 1980s, many people didn't even know what the word suffrage meant. And so we've come a long way in terms of celebrating the 19th Amendment in 2020 and what goes on beyond it. So nobody could have predicted that November 2020 we would have the first woman of color and the first woman in the White House. And so this is all part of a very incredible and very exciting story.
I should mention that Elizabeth did an oxen tour of Sullivan County, which is a little bit close to you. And I don't know that she didn't go in your direction, but the oxen team seemed quite a bit more ponderous than the horse, but the her wagon. The other, I know some other people are asking questions. As far as I know, she did not necessarily keep in touch with Rosalie Jones. I think she was probably too radical at that point. But really one of the seriously regrets in my life is that Rosalie Jones, when I was doing this research, was still alive. And of course, this is pre-internet. And how would you know that Rosalie Jones was still alive? You know, and so I could have gone down and interviewed her, and it would have been just beyond fabulous, but it didn't happen. So, and ditto for Ida B. Craft. Somebody mentioned Ida Craft, and who I did trace down a little bit. She, I think she was a lesbian, which wouldn't surprise anybody if you've seen her picture, but she was quite a stalwart on a lot of these efforts. And she was in the picture in Boston, and certainly on the hike to New York and Albany and so forth. She was a real, they called her Colonel Craft. But she left all of her money to her a long-term friend. So that's my evidence. So somebody, Jeannie said, do you have scripts of full speeches? I don't. Again, that would have been useful. I mean, the press covered a lot, but not, you know, I have one speech of her in her pacifist days, you know, kind of a rousing speech. It's interesting, there was a reporter who followed her around for an entire day, and she gave speeches the whole day, street corners and whatever. And he said she never repeated herself twice. So extemporaneous speaking was her kind of her specialty. So that was kind of cool. And I see that Tricia it was from St. John, or near St. Johnland. And so when Mary Freeman brought the three children, my grandfather and Jane's sister Jane, Elizabeth's sister Jane and Elizabeth, over, they were quite little. And St. Johnland had an orphanage at that point. And she must have worked for St. Johnland, which is in northern Long Island. And the kids were kind of put in the orphanage, which my grandfather was just like, this is the worst possible thing that could have ever happened to me. You know, I mean, he was really kind of freaked out by it, as was Jane. Elizabeth, I think, maybe got to stay with her mother more. I don't know the answer to that one. But I know that the archivist at St. Johnland is trying to get a marker, you know, one of those, what they call history on a stick, you know, those little blue markers down in Long Island. So, you know, she's been doing some great research. And it may be that a sister of Mary Freeman was already there, and that's the connection. We otherwise would have no idea why. But that's, you know, there's so many wonderful historians that just find these little bits that add the piece to the puzzle. And they're so generous with their work. It's just astounding to me that there's a whole other story about her going to England and smuggling in literature and evading the British Secret Service. And I haven't even gotten to that story yet, but it's amazing. And some little British researcher who was doing something completely different said, oh, here, this came up and I thought you'd like to see it. And sent me all these great, like, historical documents about the British Secret Service. I'm like, you know, so very cool.
Peg, I had a question, Natalie Naylor. Did you find any evidence that Elizabeth Freeman and Rosalie Jones had met in England? Was there any?
No, and do you know that Rosalie was in England?
Yes, she was.
Okay.
Well, that's quite likely. They were kind of a little band of Americans in England. We'd have to match up the times, but if they were there the same time, she was there 1905 to 1911, then that's quite likely. And that's, you know, are you a relative of hers or?
No, no, but Jane, who's on, has been investigating, researching her, and that's one of the questions we had, I know.
Well, I don't have direct knowledge of that, although it makes me want to go back through the London pictures that she has and see if I can pick out Rosalie. I don't think I can. I mean, I think I would have noticed that, but I can look at it again. And I would love to be in touch with that person because Rosalie was quite a great figure in Elizabeth's life and in the, you know, these stunts that they did were just, you know, not only fearless, but really did capture a lot of media. I mean, my impression, and maybe there are historians here that will contradict this, but my impression is that the US suffrage movement in the early 1900s was kind of sleepy. And a lot of the militants who were trained in England, I think, just livened things up. And Elizabeth is a great example of that. I mean, there were many others, including Alice Paul, of course, who just like wanted to shake things up. And Elizabeth really did trade on all her militant credentials. We have no evidence that she broke windows. It was sort of after her time in England. But she, you know, she was happy to say that in the paper because she knew what would get in the paper. You know, and then she would say, well, you know, US men or the American men are really much different and they're much more open and they're much more gentlemen and so forth. And then, you know.
But she was arrested in England, wasn't she?
She was arrested. Yeah, it's a little hard to tell how many times, but by some accounts, like 6 times. And that's how she got started, is that she was just, you know, got off a bus and she saw this policeman beating up on this woman and she tried to protect the woman and they both got arrested, of course. And she's like, why am I in jail again? And according to my mother, she had to really think about whether she wanted to throw herself into this cause. And she spent some time on the continent to kind of really think about that. And when she came back, she just was all in. And I think my read of her as a younger woman, she was very involved in the Salvation Army. And the Salvation Army at that point was another kind of disruptive force. You know, they'd have street meetings and they'd have music and they were really focusing on the poor and helping the poor. And she had a real passion and she needed that passion to go somewhere. And the militant suffrage movement was perfect for her. So you know, and I think it was perfect for a lot of people. So yeah, Tisha, thanks for, they called the US movement the doldrums. I think that's pretty accurate. So yeah.
Hi, Peg. It's Jane Swersey. I have written to you, and those 1,000 hits you've had on your website, 900 have been from me. I just love.
Well, thank you.
And I just keep going back to it and back to it. I think I have 2 thoughts for you, but one is 3 thoughts. I would love to see those pictures of Elizabeth Freeman in England and see if there is a connection with Rosalie Jones. I would just love to. But when Elizabeth Freeman was in England, on your website, you have a letter from Emily Pithick Lawrence, who's saying, you know, who's thanking her and for having a conscience and sorry she sprained, I guess it was her wrist. But I really believe there are books that there was an event called Black Friday.
Yeah.
And it was she was there and she did a testimony in England. And if you match up the dates, that's probably how she sprained her wrist. So,
on the back of that envelope, it says, but I went anyway.
Right. So I had another comment and I forgot.
Take a minute.
I'll be right back. Let me
Okay.
just think a minute.
Peg,
Is that Rosalie Jones financed paid Elizabeth's play when they were campaigning together, whether Long Island or Ohio, for suffrage.
That's my sense of, again, I don't have proof of that, but that makes sense to me. She,
That-
and she learned a lot. I think Elizabeth helped her come out of her shell a little bit, and there's some information in the press of like, well, I don't do public speaking, but by the end of the campaign, she was doing a lot of public speaking and just a lot more fearless. So I think it was a good association for both of them.
I'm back. Rosalie did help finance Elizabeth in the Ohio campaign, and that's in the New York State Women's Suffrage Association records, like, because Rosalie writes a letter and she says, can I have Elizabeth? Because Elizabeth was a paid worker. For them.
Really?
So
Wow.
that's there. And the other thing I was thinking of is I think Elizabeth was too radical for Alice Paul. Alice Paul gets so much credit, but I've been, especially with the issue of race. I mean, Alice Paul did not want anything, she's doing the parade. She did not want the issue of race. But on your website, you have a picture of Elisabeth Freeman and Lulu Bolt is her name, and they're carrying rifles.
Yes.
And I really want to know about that picture.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I think we talked about this a little bit. Yeah, I'm guessing, she did a lot of costume stuff, and she had she won a costume, like a Halloween costume contest, where she dressed up as a prisoner from Holloway, and her friend, I think Elsie Mackenzie, dressed up as a warder in the prison, and they won first place in the contest. So again, any opportunity to get some play out there. So I'm kind of guessing that there's no evidence that she was that kind of militant, that she was, good with guns. Maybe some rocks here and there, but nothing like a gun. So I don't know. I don't completely get what that is about. And every time I talk to historians like yourself, amateur or professional, it's just like, what am I doing? I should be doing all this. I should be going to all these archives, because there is a lot of unfinished business about Elisabeth Freeman, I'm sure. I'm just putting out what I have and, hoping it'll be helpful to people.
But there's one story I'd like you to tell, Peg, and that goes back to my years in Woodstock when Jane Van de Bogart had a ring. And of course, that was the first time I really felt like I had a real connection with Elizabeth through Jane. And then Jane told me it was a copy of a ring that a suffrage activist in England gave to Elisabeth Freeman. And so you have that ring. She's disappearing. I don't know if she's disappearing to get the ring, but Peg has the ring, and the ring has been talked about and written about, correct, Peg?
Yes, well, the story, it's a wonderful story, and Elizabeth had a little note to one of her nieces about what the story was, and she said, well, there was this Indian princess, Sophia, she didn't even name her, and so it turns out it's Sophia. I have the book right here. It's a wonderful book, and it was the granddaughter of this woman, and her father was her father was a prince in one of the states in India who was pushed out by the British, and her mother was an aristocracy in England. And the family, particularly Sophia, was adopted by Queen Victoria. And she was a very, fierce suffrage person. And she and Elizabeth sold papers in Trafalgar Square. So when Elizabeth was coming back to the United States, she wanted to offer her a little memento. And she offered her, and she asked what she wanted. Elizabeth said, well, I'd like a copy of your ring. And so, can I show this ring? Yes. So this is the ring. It's called a Wishbone Ring. And my mother has one, Jane had one, my other cousin had one, and I had one, which is not this one. And so the ring showed eligibility, and you'd put it on your first finger, and the stone, or sometimes lower casts, it'd be even wire or string or something. But of course, hers was gold, and it sometimes had a little birthstone, and it showed that you were eligible for marriage. So that was the story of the ring, and it was very special in the family. And I wore it for years and years and years. And last year I lost mine. And I don't know, because it just fell off my finger and I lost it. And I was really heartbroken. And then we were cleaning house and my partner said, look at this. And this is another copy of the ring that now I'm not allowed to wear because I might lose it again. But maybe we'll have it adjusted, we'll see. But anyway, that is the story of the ring. And there's a wonderful book called, I'll pull it down if you want, Sophia, I think is the name of the book. And the granddaughter is a prominent television journalist in England. So anyway, the other thing I wanted to mention is that on the site, elisabethfreeman.org, I have a blog feature that's going on. And I wrote a whole blog about this ring and about losing it, but mostly about the ring, not so much losing it. And I should add a little addendum, but there's some interesting little stories. So what I've tried to do is pull out of the scrapbook sort of more interesting stories that have amused me or moved me or whatever. So there is, if you haven't been to elisabethfreeman.org, the blog feature is kind of fun. And the other sort of newer thing is that I just started a family, kind of like a family of organizers and radicals, let me just say, called johnstonfreemanfamily.org. And on that is a section about Jane and some of the documents that I have of her history and as we progress, but also some of her brother, Carl Whitman, who was a pretty famous organizer in his own right. And so that might be of useful or of interest to people who knew her. So FYI. And I should introduce Helen, who's right in the middle of my screen. Thank you. Who helped me make these sites as lovely and functional as they really are, because yay you. I'd be just, telling stories here if I didn't have her.
These are great projects to work on. I'm enjoying it very much.
Yeah, great. Are there other questions? Let's see.
There was one about Camp Woodland. Did Jane mention going to Camp Woodland, or do you know?
I mean, I was pretty sure I knew that she went there. Camp Woodland was probably made famous by Pete Seeger, and he taught music to these little radical children of radical parents. And so he, but I think she was one of the last groups of people to go there. But it was it was definitely for radical kids. I mean, kids of radical families. So, Alan, I see you. Do you know more about Camp Woodland than I do? Probably. He's saying no. Don't call on me. Well, feel free to jump in if you like. So, other questions that we have a couple of minutes maybe. I really appreciate all the information here.
I think about 10 years ago, or 8 or 10 years ago, the Camp Woodland ex-campers had quite a reunion. I think they had it in Phoenicia, if I'm not mistaken. I kind of happened on it. I mean, I wasn't affiliated with Camp Woodland, but I happened to just be in the right place at the right time, I guess.
I did find some slides of Camp Woodland in that one of those last years. I guess if you hadn't been there, they weren't that exciting, a picture of a hill or, whatever. But I put them aside in case there's an archive of Camp Woodland somewhere, which I think there is at the State Museum. So I'd be happy to send them off to them for whatever they're worth. My philosophy is when I find things, I try to send them back where they came from, if that would be useful. So
I think the graduates of Camp Woodland are that survived. They have very, very happy memories, fond memories of their experiences there.
Well, really, Pete Seeger's your music teacher. How can you go wrong?
I know, exactly.
Yeah. Jeannie, you're a women's studies expert professor. You have any comments on this?
No, I just was thinking, I teach, I've told you about this. I teach a role-playing game in my Intro to Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies class. It's set in New York City in 1913. And it's bohemians who, it's historically based, and it's a group of bohemians who hang out at this cafe, and they have to decide whether to go to a New Jersey labor pageant or to a suffrage march in Washington, D.C. And so all the students get to be, they play parts. And Ida Rao is in it. She was one of the speakers that Elizabeth spoke with. Big Bill Haywood is in it. He was in Chicago with her, I saw. So I kept seeing names from the game, right? If she had hung out in Soho or Greenwich Village, I probably would have her in my game. But I didn't write the game, and they only put in people who were actually in Greenwich Village or Soho that year. But I was thinking that I would love to take that video to my class and show it to them as they're preparing their game this year, because I don't think my students fully get that those are real people they're playing. I mean, I give them articles written by the character, the people who are characters in the game, but I don't think they really believe that they're real somehow.
Well, I think there's something about history that when you're dealing with original sources,
yeah,
it just jumps off the page and you're like, wait a minute, look at this, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
So, well, I'm posting that video on the internet, so you certainly have access to it. And I don't know if probably most of you are old enough to remember the movie Reds or
Oh
Red.
yeah, I show them that script, parts of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So in that movie, one of the sort of central places is this cafe that's sort of communal. They have one big table. I don't know how accurate any of it is, but I can't imagine. I mean, she lived on West 12th Street, so I can't imagine she wasn't somewhat aware of it or frequented it or whatever. So,
yeah, yeah.
And in the 20s, I think people kind of went underground a little bit. They weren't as active in public spots because they were all afraid of getting swept up by the early kind of House Un-American activities, you know, called the Palmer raids and so forth. But
I think you said in 15 she was still in England, right?
No, she came back in 1911. And
1911. Oh, okay,
yeah,
good. Yeah.
So, yeah,
So
no, in
taking
15 she was still doing suffrage work, mostly in upstate New York.
Yeah.
But that gives you a flavor of kind of that milieu of everybody sort of knowing each other. I mean, the fact that she knew Upton Sinclair and a couple of other people that you would know in that, you know, a couple of radical ministers and stuff like that. I mean, they all knew each other.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean,
I also love that the NAACP thing that you showed us calls her an agent of the NAACP.
Yeah, yeah.
I just love that. I think that's important. You know, I think that we have lost so much knowledge of the people who worked with these organizations at the beginning, but who were not founders and who were not leaders in the organization necessarily. And I think that's important.
Apparently she was up for a job as an organizer with the NAACP, and that didn't happen. I hope they hired a Black person to do it, actually, but she got picked up by the anti-war movement, the Peace Federation and so forth, so, which was fine. Yeah, so. Any other last minute questions? This has been really a delight for me. I've learned a lot. You're supposed to not learn a lot when you're supposed to know a lot, but I learned a lot from all of you.
Yes, and the presentation, Peg, was just fabulous.
Thank you so much.
I love that the scrapbook and the close up of all the different leaflets and etc. It's a beautiful piece. And I'm so glad that we can share it.
Well, it's a, 1/1000th of what's there, but yes, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yes, Peg, it was wonderful. And thank you, Marguerite, also.